The Ayatollah and his government have made it clear that they're not backing down on enrichment. They don't consider their program to have been obliterated at all. Ordo facility, I don't think they really necessarily destroyed all the centrifuges down there. If they've proven that they've mastered the fuel cycle and that they can enrich uranium hexafluoride gas, in diplomatic language, what they're saying there is, I could make an atom bomb. Let's not get it to that level. If we attack them, they're going to be much more likely to make a nuke. We absolutely are on a path back to war. The Russians are winning slowly, and there doesn't seem to be any changing that. We're not in any real position of strength to make Russia stop. America and our Ukrainian friends will have fought and lost this whole war for nothing. Wherever crime is bad, Trump is going to call out the National Guard and maybe even the Army, and leave them there for how long? This is the United States of America, man, not some sock puppet fascist dictatorship. As far as bringing out regular infantry or anything like that, this is an absolute outrage. Nobody should stand for this. Just because you like the guy in power now, Chelsea Clinton could be our next president. Let's get real, dude.
World War III is already happening.
This is a house of cards, and it is in the process of collapsing right now.
You're going to see an economic crash, the likes of which we've never seen.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So today on the channel we have Scott Horton. He's Libertarian Foreign Policy Bulldog, host of the Scott Horton Show and author of Provoked, his latest on how Washington's choices fueled the Ukraine catastrophe. Now, Scott, you've done, I think, the record podcast with Lex Friedman. Is that correct? 10 hours?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
So we're going to try to condense that 10 hours into 1 hour. So we're going to have to be very succinct today.
I can do that. Bob Murphy, the great Austrian economist, he said, Scott does these interviews and it's sort of like a fractal. He can do he can do the interview in an hour with Tom Woods, the same interview in 3 hours with Tucker Carlson, and then the same interview with Lex Friedman for 10 and a half hours. And it's the same story, just with more and more detail, depending on how much time I have,
All right. Well, let's hope we can put it in layman's terms, and maybe that will simplify things a little bit. So Where do we start here? What is top of mind for you geopolitically? I'd like to kind of get your insight into every theater of conflict around the world. Obviously, we're not going to do an in-depth historical analysis. If you guys want that, go read Scott's books. Go check out his YouTube channel. Check out the Lex Friedman podcast. I want to be kind of forward focused in this conversation, and I want to know what you are expecting to kind of unfold in these various theaters based on all of your insights. So maybe let's start, I guess, with one that is kind of most fresh in the news cycle, which of course would be this peace deal with Hamas and Israel. And what are the implications, the broader implications for Iran? Many people are still suspecting that there are things percolating there that suggest that a conflict is imminent. What are your thoughts on the deal? Is it going to hold? And is it a deal which you think both sides come out victorious or come out appeased?
Well, look, I guess I would say I'm hopefully pessimistic. Israel holds all the cards and the Palestinians hold none. And so Hamas holds not very many, but, the Israelis also have the American superpower on their side. In this case, Hamas had stuck by this whole time that they would not give up all the hostages until the Israelis agreed to withdraw from all of the Gaza Strip. They have now climbed down on that and allowed under the first phase of this deal, the Israelis get to stay in much of the Strip, though not all of it.
Wow.
And they've said that they're just betting on Donald Trump, that Donald Trump swore to them that he was going to prevent the Israelis from breaking the ceasefire and restarting the war, which is what they did this spring. You'll remember Trump arranged a ceasefire right before he got into office. I think mostly for the PR. He wanted to look real good as he was coming into office, that he could get this ceasefire. And then the Israelis broke the deal and started the war again. That was agreed by all sides, including the Israelis, that they were supposed to go to the second phase of negotiations then. And the Israelis just started bombing instead and put the siege on that lasted for 2 full months of no supplies and all that stuff. So, and even after Trump declared the ceasefire, the Israelis are still bombing. They've been bombing Lebanon this whole time after the ceasefire with Hezbollah there. So, what the future really looks like here, I'm not sure. Now, to become prime minister, again, Netanyahu had to join into a coalition with guys who were to the right of him, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir especially. And these guys are, avowed Jewish supremacists and greater Israel expanders, etc. And they have made it clear that their agenda this whole time is to completely replace the population in the Gaza Strip with Jewish settlers and to move the Palestinians somewhere else.
And do they have popularity? Like if Netanyahu was ousted for whatever reason, would these guys likely have public support?
To replace him? I'm really not sure. The last time he was forced out of office or, had to step down for political reasons for a little while, it was Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid who replaced him temporarily there. And so, they were, all things considered, less worse than these guys who are, much more religiously inspired nationalist expanders. Although Naftali Bennett, it should be said, is the cause of the September 11th attack. It was his strike on a UN shelter in 1996. He called in an artillery strike on a UN shelter and killed 106 women and children. And that made it onto the front page of Osama bin Laden's declaration of war against the United States. And that inspired Mohammed Atta and Ramzi bin al-Shibh to join al-Qaeda. And that was the lead hijacker and the ringleader and his best buddy co-organizer of the September 11th attack on this country was as revenge for literally Naftali Bennett killing women and children in Lebanon in 1996. So, on the other hand, he seems to be a more rational type these days compared to kooks like Ben-Gvir, who are just, ruthless ethnic supremacists. So,
I think he's going to have a heart attack soon by the looks of things.
Yeah, he's a pretty high-strung guy. Yeah. But now Netanyahu said as well in May that, look, we're destroying their homes so they have no homes to come back to. And he was being very explicit there. Sometimes he, feigns being click to the more reasonable of these kooks, but he's really not. And they were pushing very hard. And, our staff at antiwar.com, especially led by Dave DeCamp, have been keeping close track on all of Israel and America's efforts to try to coerce the Libyans, the Tunisians, the Ethiopians, the Sudanese, the Indonesians, anyone to take the Palestinians, which imagine what that would look like, right? Like, it's no different really than putting them all on boxcars to the east, like in World War II. I mean, you're going to ship all these people to Indonesia, 2 million of them, on what ships? And I mean, it's just the whole thing is completely insane, but they really pushed hard for that, but no one will take them. The Egyptians and, the pro-Israeli Zionists will often say, literally echoing Hitler after the Evian conference, that, see, nobody wants them because of what filthy, diseased, horrible terrorists they are, when that's not why. And that is exactly what Hitler said about the Jews after Evian, when America and the rest of the Western states refused to accept the Jewish refugees. But the reason why is because if the Muslims are all forced out of historic Palestine, the last of historic Palestine, then they lose control over those holy sites. And for example, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is where Muhammad was said to have ascended to heaven when he died. It's the third most important site in Islam. And if the Palestinians are completely driven out of Palestine, then the Israeli Jews blow up that mosque and rebuild the temple and all of that. And, probably start another major regional war. And so all of that is what's at stake. So it's not that there's something inherently, like, oh, the Palestinians all have tuberculosis or they're just all such degenerate, horrible people. They can't be allowed in. That's not true at all. It's terrible Israeli propaganda against them, really. But
there's a view that I've heard, and I don't know if it's true, that the Palestinian people are very industrious. Kind of in the same way that many, people of the Israeli ilk have been accused of being, and that this is part of the reason why lots of surrounding countries are reluctant to allow them in, because they're kind of go-getters. They're like, they're very determined to be successful. Is that something you've heard before?
No, I really don't know a whole lot about the Palestinian diaspora other than how they suffered in the Yarmouk camp outside of Damascus during Obama's horrible, dirty war there. But as far as like the Palestinian status in Jordan and all that, I don't know. But I do know that virtually everywhere that people have a massive wave of immigration or migration, or especially refugees come in, then yeah, as we know in our own country, people get very protectionist about them losing their jobs to people who just got here from somewhere else. And so it is, would be expected that, and it's also, again, considered to a degree anyway, and this may be an excuse, but it's also considered a form of protection of the Palestinian people and their nationhood to keep them in these giant camps and let them still be Palestinians rather than really integrating them as Syrians or Jordanians. They're Palestinians waiting to go home someday. And that's, in a sense, protecting them in their interests rather than telling them that, no, it's over for you and you're never going to go home. That's the Israelis' position. That's not supposed to be the position of the neighboring states. So they may be kind of hiding behind that in a way, as you say, as kind of economic protectionism against these people. But they've been stuck there for generations now in these other countries. But I was going to say real quick about Netanyahu himself saying he wanted to get rid of these people. And I just think he didn't have anywhere to put them. And so what happened was, I think Donald Trump is helping him climb down now, basically, and saying, look, this can't just go on indefinitely. If we're being reasonable here, we're not talking about propaganda from Madison Avenue. We're just talking about reality. You can't eradicate Hamas without just killing every last fighting age male in the Strip, which you can't do without just killing them all, without casualties that no one will tolerate. And so at some point, what are we even doing? So
you don't think this peace deal is really going to hold because it seems as though it's a irreconcilable situation ultimately when you take it far enough into the future. You're going to have Hamas still, obviously, in the Strip, and they're not going to be able to effectively eradicate Hamas. It's impossible because you have to take out everybody. So what do you think the broader implications are for the surrounding region? Because when you look at the axis of resistance, as it's been called, seemingly has been gutted. You have Syria that's collapsed. You have Lebanon, which has been suppressed. You have the Gaza Strip now, which has largely been suppressed. And so what is Netanyahu's next move if he wants to avoid, being ousted and whatever sort of legal ramifications that might have? Is there potentially a pathway here to an Iran 2.0? Because it seems as though they're setting up the conditions for another conflict. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that suggests that they're preparing for a second Iran war. We have an increased deployment of THAAD systems. We have the Saudi-Pakistan nuclear pact. We have the U.S. pact with Qatar, the strategic pact, which is like, I think it's a military mutual defense pact, if I'm not mistaken. You have the USS Ford in the Mediterranean, and you also have the snapback sanctions, which have now been imposed. It seems as though they are getting ready to make another move on Iran, despite all the well-meaning words and the lip service and rhetoric from Trump that the situation has been resolved there. What are your thoughts on Iran?
I think you're right that it's not resolved. I'm not sure how imminent all of this is. They've been threatening and posturing and surrounding and bullying Iran for this whole century long and before. So on the other hand, I have to admit to you that I'm operating more on background knowledge than being all the way up to date and reading all of the latest stuff on this. So you may very well be referring to facts in the news that I'm, like, for example, I wasn't up on where the carriers are and this and that right now. So I don't want to play down anything that I literally don't know about. I can say on the larger picture of the situation that, especially as you ended the question there, Trump was wrong when he said that their program had been obliterated. Now, it's a fact that they were severely set back. And I think the Fordo facility, I don't think they really necessarily destroyed all the centrifuges down there. They bombed every shaft. They bombed all the entrances and supposedly made it off limits. I think if they detect the Iranians trying to dig a new mine shaft down there, then they'll just bomb that shaft too, kind of thing. So I think, last I heard anyway, Fordo is essentially off limits. I don't know if there were people down there that got buried alive or what, but I think that one's basically done. That's the also known as QOM, QOM. Then there's Natanz. And now Natanz, from what I read, was less damaged and was still operable. And they had, under the JCPOA, they had scaled back the number of centrifuges they were running, but they still had some cascades running there. And from what I had read, the electric plant, on the ground level had been destroyed and that kind of thing. But the underground facility had remained mostly undamaged. On the other hand, I don't know whether it's still operating or what they're doing with it. I do know, importantly, that their conversion facility at Isfahan, and particularly the one big building where they did the conversion, has been destroyed with just Tomahawk cruise missiles, I believe. And what that is that's a place where you take the uranium metal, convert it into uranium hexafluoride gas, which then you introduce into the centrifuges to spin it to increase the percentage of uranium-235, which is the sweet stuff for your electricity program, your medical isotope program, or potentially atomic weapons, right? And then you got to convert it back into metal to be the, fuel
Trigger?
rods or fissile material for a weapon or whatever. So that conversion facility has been destroyed. Now, what it's going to take for them to build a new one to replace it and, bury deep enough somewhere that they can get away with it and all that, I really don't know. That's a engineering question, a technical question. I don't know. I know that the Israelis also murdered, many of the nuclear scientists and their families during the war as well. So in terms of the intellectual setback there and how to quantify that, I couldn't tell you, but it seemed pretty severe. At the same time, at the end of the war, they said, we are already working on a new facility for enrichment, just deeper tunnel under a taller mountain. So screw you guys. So that may very well be true. Now, again, you got to be able to get out. So you got to have a tunnel and we can drop a bomb down a tunnel shaft. So I don't know exactly how that's going to play out, but the Ayatollah and his government have made it clear that they're not backing down on enrichment. They don't consider their program to have been obliterated at all, only set back, and that they're still going to keep going. Now, the thing of it is that Donald Trump has adopted the Israelis' point of view, that for them to have a nuclear program at all means that they have a nuclear weapons program and that they're on the cusp of a nuclear bomb. Even right after the war started, Netanyahu went on Fox News and told Brett Baer, they're somewhere around like a year away. In other words, if they tried to begin to try to make one now, it would take them a year. So he was admitting right there that he'd been lying, that there was any kind of threat to preempt other than Israel just doesn't want Iran to have a nuclear program at all. And where Bush and Obama and Biden had told them no, Trump was telling them, fine, go ahead, let's do it. And so they decided to go ahead and try to destroy it. But the thing is, the Ayatollah, I guess, okay, there's two ways to interpret this. And I'm not asking anybody to be naive about it. I'm not either. One way to interpret his statement is that he's just insisting for sovereignty and independence sake that you can't tell me that I can't have a civilian nuclear program. They have their own supplies of domestic uranium that they can burn for their electricity and sell their oil on the market if they could ever get out from under the sanctions. So they have a very plausible economic excuse of opportunity costs to have a civilian nuclear program. People say, whoa, they got all that oil. Well, they got all that uranium too. So yeah. And there's obviously a much bigger market for global oil than for uranium. So makes sense. On the other hand, this whole time, for 20 years, every anti-war expert and many hawks too, I think, have characterized, I thought correctly, I guess I still mostly think correctly, had characterized Iran's civilian nuclear program as a latent nuclear deterrent, right? If they've proven that they've mastered the fuel cycle and that they can enrich uranium hexafluoride gas up to whatever percent they feel like and convert it back to metal again, then what are they saying, right? In body language, in diplomatic language, what they're saying there is, I could make an atom bomb. Let's not get it to that level. It's the same thing as Japan, same as Germany and Brazil, that everybody knows they have advanced nuclear programs. If they needed to, they could come up with weapons fuel and make nuclear weapons out of it. But their position is, hey, don't anybody ever put us in that position, right? Japan right now could get nukes. But what would that do other than escalate tensions with China? When they have no interest in doing that. China doesn't seem to have an interest in escalating tensions with Japan right now. Japan right now, of course, is allied with the United States, which is armed to the teeth with H-bombs. And so, fine, all other things being equal, makes no sense for them to go ahead and get a bomb. Same kind of thing here. The Ayatollah is in a different position than Japan, of course. He doesn't have a H-bomb superpower as an ally. But his position was, listen, if you don't attack me, and he never said this, by the way, but it was the diplomatic language of the advanced civilian program was pretty clear, I thought. The implication was, don't attack me, and I won't make a nuke. While the Americans were saying, listen, don't you make a nuke or we'll attack you. And so it was the perfect standoff until it got ruined last June. And all Obama's nuclear deal of 2015 really did was it just like super ratified the standoff, right? That we already were at, right? Like, why didn't George W. Bush launch strikes? Because they weren't making nuclear weapons. The CIA put out a giant report, the NIA of November 2007, saying they're not making nuclear weapons. So he goes, well, he wrote in his memoir, how am I supposed to attack them when the CIA says they're not even making nuclear weapons? Just like Tulsi Gabbard, the DNI and the CIA were saying this year, they're not making nuclear weapons. It's just Trump said, I don't care what she says. In other words, he's accepting, just as W. Bush did with the intelligence about Iraq. Well, you guys can report to me whatever you want. I'll interpret it however I want, right? And so he says, well, hey, she says they have a nuclear program. And I say that's the same thing as them having a nuclear weapons program. And I say they're not allowed to have a nuclear weapons program. So I'm authorizing this Israeli war and then backing them up in the thing. Right.
Well, there were several Iranian officials themselves who even said that if they wanted to, getting to that higher point of enrichment is actually much faster. Like the first phase of enrichment, I think 0 to 60% or whatever, it takes a long time, but it actually gets a lot quicker as you approach, that 90% grade.
So let's talk about that real quick.
So that they could potentially have, made a nuclear weapon. But one of my questions I have would be, well, if it clearly isn't much of a deterrent if, the being a threshold state is what is being used as justification for an intervention, then how is that a deterrent? I mean, if you're going to get nuclear weapons, just do it in secret or don't do it at all. Right.
So, yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It seems like it was not much of one. Although, well, look, no, I take that back. I think having a latent deterrent was an effective deterrent against W. Bush and Barack Obama. That, look, they're not making a nuke now. If we attack them, we're not going to be able to, look, we're not invading Persia and effecting a regime change for real. Even if we kill the Ayatollah, another guy will declare himself Ayatollah. So the regime itself is not going to crumble under airstrikes. That's not how this works. So what are we going to do? We're going to bomb them. Then, having called their bluff, they're going to go ahead and turn and make nukes. So let's not drive them to that point. That's what I was saying. That was the point of the Obama nuclear deal, was everybody just freeze frame here. Okay, we don't want you to make a nuke. We want double extra super verification that you're not making a nuke, which they got in the deal, and expanded inspections and scaled back their program in numerous ways so that everybody's reassured that, again, if they decided to make a nuke, it would take them at least a year and we could easily bomb the crap out of them before they were done, right? You can't have a Manhattan Project under airstrikes, right? So in other words, that was the standoff and it was effective for a long time. But then Netanyahu under Donald Trump called the Ayatollah's bluff, and the Ayatollah was essentially standing there naked, right? His security forces suck. They lost all of their anti-aircraft in the first wave of strikes due to sabotage and just effective cruise missile strikes and standoff range airstrikes from planes. All their SM-300s were what? Just out in the open, or I don't know what, but just were completely destroyed. They had essentially no anti-aircraft. The Israelis and then the Americans had total air dominance over the country, bombed whatever they wanted to. And when Trump flew the B-2s in, they didn't even take a single pot shot at them. Who knows if they even knew they were there by that point, because they had, really decimated them. Now, they didn't sink all their Navy and destroy their entire standing army force and all of that kind of stuff. which I guess they could have.
Yeah.
Certainly they could have targeted that. They targeted a lot of officers and that kind of thing. But so, yeah, now their bluff is called. And the question is, are they now going to make nukes? And I was going to say before, now that we bomb them, they kicked the IAEA out of the country for what, like 2.5 months? And now they're inviting the IAEA back in now. But now, after all these years since they began enrichment, now we have a true break in the chain of custody of the chain of surveillance by the IAEA. So this whole time they've been able to say, and you always hear this nitpick BS about, oh, supposedly an isotope was found here, there. All that stuff is always quickly resolved. But when it comes to actual a secret program of any kind, the IAEA has always been able to verify the non-diversion of nuclear material in Iran to any military purpose. They've said that over and over for 25 years here, 20 years. So, but now that chain of surveillance is broken. So is it not only possible, but even likely that now they are going to make a real nuclear deterrent or attempt to? I think so. At least that's what I've been warning about for 20 years. The Ayatollah swears, and his men swear, that the old Ayatollah's fatwa and the current Ayatollah's fatwa both still stand. And that fatwa says that God says that weapons of mass destruction are haram. Forget it. No. And that's it. Now, you and I know that the Supreme Leader is just a politician. He can change his mind about what God changed his mind about tomorrow morning if he feels like it. No problem. But so far, at least they claim that God hasn't changed his mind yet and that they are not going to make nuclear weapons even now. Bluff called. You could say, like, forget any sincerity on the part of the regime here, okay? They're a very weak state up against the superpower. They knew that if they made nukes, we'd attack them. So they thought, well, if we bluff that we know how to make nukes, so don't make us make nukes, then they won't attack us. Let's try that. And that worked for a while. Then we call their bluff and bomb the crap out of them. And then they realize, I'm saying this is one potentiality of trying to read the Ayatollah's mind here, that like, look, what the hell are they going to do? They're totally overmatched. If they really try to make a nuclear bomb, they're not going to be able to do it in secret. And we're going to go back to war. Now, and so now from the Israelis' point of view, as you said, Netanyahu still has legal trouble and wants and needs conflict. And so it would serve him. And Trump has, again, accepted Netanyahu's definition of the stakes here, that for Iran to have enrichment at all, which, again, Bush and Obama and previous Trump and Biden had at least made their peace with, if not outright accepted, for them to have enrichment at all is equivalent to them making nuclear weapons, and we won't tolerate it and we'll bomb them again. So if that's the point, then we are on, and look, Donald Trump can flip-flop and change his mind on that and redefine it however he wants tomorrow morning as well, right? Thank goodness for that, at least. But as far as the way he's defined the stakes now, we absolutely are on a path back to war. The Iranians insist they're going to keep enriching. And so that just means that
they have also said that they don't want them to have a ballistic missile program, which of course is a non-starter for any sort of agreement. So even if they were to concede their nuclear program, you know, they would want to go a step further and dismantle their entire, you know, missile program.
Yeah. And, you know, if America's interests were what was paramount here rather than Israeli interests, it would have made perfect sense for Donald Trump, when he came into power in 2017, to say to the Ayatollah, listen, I don't like the nuclear deal, but my predecessor got it done. So I'm going to act as though you negotiated this thing in good faith. I'm going to pretend to myself that you did. I'm going to trust but verify and continue to verify. But you know what? I really don't like some of these sunset provisions, and I really would like to kick these cans down the road further, or maybe get rid of these sunsets altogether. We've all agreed you can enrich uranium. I don't see why you need more than X many centrifuges spinning. He could have just approached it that way. And so, look, I don't necessarily like you, and you don't necessarily like me, but what the hell? I'm the president of the USA, man. I'm the 800 trillion megaton gorilla around here. I ain't afraid of no Ayatollah. So let me tell you how it's going to be, Ayatollah. I want you to lift these sunsets. And in exchange, I'll give you the sanctions relief and et cetera, whatever. And just do diplomacy. He could have done that. That would have been in the interest of the United States to put this whole thing to bed then. But instead, he let the Israelis drive the whole thing to crisis. You know what? Even if you take the Israelis' claims in the spring of 2018 that they had found this whole treasure trove of Iranian nuclear documents that proved that they were trying to make an atom bomb and all this stuff, which I think is a bunch of crap anyway. But even if you'd taken all that at face value, that would have been a great lever for Donald Trump to demand that the Iranians come back to the table and prepare to come to Jesus. We're really angry about all these documents the Israelis claim to have discovered, and we want these sunsets lifted, damn it. We want concessions. We want movement, and there is something in it for you. We can move toward normalization, you know? And he just couldn't do that. He let the Israelis drive him to break the deal and drive the crisis. Now, you mentioned the 60% uranium. Part of this was, first of all, part of Trump withdrawing from the deal. But secondly, in the December of 2020, in Trump's lame duck period there, the Israelis, using the MEK communist terrorist cult, the Mujahideen cult, did this remote control machine gun attack against the head of Iran's nuclear program, a guy named Fakhrizadeh. And at that point was when they started enriching up to 20% uranium again, which there's a plausible denial there that they need that for their medical isotope reactor. And so that's within the parameters of the safeguards agreement with the IAEA and the rest. But it's also a little bit of hardball in diplomacy too, right? As you said, it's almost like a parabola. The higher enriched uranium you got, the easier it is to enrich it even higher than that, right? Just because the weight of the 238 on the outside, I guess, the way the isotopes spin out, it just gets easier and easier to do it as you progress. Now, in April of 21, the Israelis did a sabotage attack at the Natanz facility. It was just on the electricity supply on the outside of the place, I guess, but it was a minor setback there. And then in response to that was when the the Iranians began to enrich to 60% uranium-235. Now, what's the point of stopping at 60% is really the question, right? We see that they did it in reaction to this thing, but what does it signify? Well, obviously it signifies a diplomatic move that, oh yeah, look, this is as high as we've ever enriched before. It's 60%. And what does that mean? That means, you know, it would be easier for us to move forward and keep going and enrich up to weapons grade, which is usually above 90%, if you want to be sure. So, in other words, it was just a diplomatic card to play. It wasn't nuclear weapons fuel, and it can be diluted back down again to electricity grade 3.6% or whatever you need. So what they were doing was they were trying to get America back in the deal. And you mentioned the snapback sanctions. They're actually not in violation of the deal, because the JCPOA itself says that if the United States, I don't know if they name us by name, but if one of the partners of the agreement leaves the agreement first, then Iran, and I guess threatened sanctions, whatever, then Iran has the right to stop abiding by certain stipulations in the agreement without leaving the agreement itself. And so that's what they've done. They've actually stayed within the agreement while violating certain limits, just as the agreement says they can in exactly these circumstances where America leaves the deal. So they're not in violation of the JCPOA. They're not in violation of their safeguards agreement, or they weren't. And we don't really know now. And I have to tell you, we really don't know. I've been warning and many anti-war people have been warning for a very long time. It's pretty obvious here. If we attack them, they're going to be much more likely to make a nuke. And here we have a break in the surveillance where it's possible for them to break out toward a nuke. And we have them swearing that they still have absolutely no intention to do so. But then again, they would say that. Mm-hmm. And then if they do get a nuke, then I'm not sure how much of a deterrent that's going to be anyway, because they don't have any weapons grade plutonium. And if they're going to make a gun type nuke, they almost certainly won't be able to fit that onto the head of a rocket. And the Americans did make a gun type artillery nuke at one time, but I think it did not work very well, and it was not that successful of a munition. And to marry one of those onto one of Iran's mid-range rockets, I think is a bunch of crap. There's no evidence that they've been working on anything like that or would be able to do anything like that. the argument always is that they would do an implosion bomb, which, technically I'm told it is possible to do an implosion bomb with uranium. It's just much more difficult to do. And they would have to test, outdoors, in the open, in the obvious for a very long time to get that right, to get the implosion systems right, to make a bomb, a deliverable bomb like that. And as you said, they want to put limits on Iran's ballistic missiles. Well, they already have missiles that can reach Israel, as we've seen. And they do have rockets that can go to space. They've delivered at least one satellite into space, I believe. And they've been attempting to launch rockets into space for about 15 years or so, at least. Now, I read a thing one time at the Federation of American Scientists, I'm pretty sure, where they were saying these rockets are not for, explosive payload delivery. These are satellite delivery rockets, and they really are different than missiles, and in many major design ways. On the other hand, obviously, if you're launching satellites into space, you're learning a lot about how to deliver intercontinental payloads somewhere if you need to.
Well, they did test ICBM recently.
But I'm saying, just to wrap that point up, that if Donald Trump cared about America first, how about he could just make a deal with the Iranians about ICBMs? Hey, we're really worried about you developing ICBMs. You know how paranoid we are about you crazy Persians. But listen, you don't want to make ICBMs, and we're not threatening you anymore anyway. So how about you just halt your range at the range you got them, and let's set up an inspection regime, and let's get back to trade and be friends. Because that's the whole thing. It's just like with Ronald Reagan, almost had a deal to abolish all American and Soviet nukes. And then he backed down and threw the deal away because he had promised that he'd build a missile defense system. Well, the missile defense system was, first of all, totally unworkable. And second of all, was totally unnecessary if you dismantle all the ICBMs, man. So how can that be the deal killer? It makes no sense.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you knew, but the Iranians have claimed that they had tested an ICBM about 2 weeks ago.
A 3-stage rocket?
I'm not sure the specifics, but that's what they were claiming. I think at some point, though, we have to stop deluding ourselves into thinking that Trump's moral rhetoric actually has any legs, and that it's not just, virtual signaling, and it's very performative for the most part. Yeah. Because, it's one thing for a politician to say nice things. It's another, for them to do good things. And what we see, especially with Russia and Ukraine, and perhaps we can kind of shift the conversation to there, is that he's saying all these good things. He's met with Putin in Alaska. But the reality of the situation is that since he's been in office, drone strikes have almost 10x'd in terms of Russia's bombardment of Ukraine, and vice versa, deep strikes into Russia. We have the delivery now, seemingly imminent delivery of Tomahawk missiles, ERAMs. We have Europe on a war footing, upping up their military spend to 5% a year. There just seems to be so much escalation, whereas you constantly hear the moral grandstanding that Trump wants peace. He really wants peace, but he's just some innocent guy that's being moved by all the neocons around him. And I'm just getting tired of, not calling a spade with respect to that. I hear so many people making apologies for this guy. It's like either you're you called the Department of Defense, the Department of War, brought together all your generals and had whatever that was, and now you're rolling out military in the streets. Like, how long are we going to delude ourselves with this idea that this guy really actually cares about peace?
Well, look, I agree with that. I think, his record from his first term in office shows that he's perfectly willing to kill people all day. He was never Ron Paul. He's Rudy Giuliani is who he is, basically. So it's understandable on that basis. On Ukraine, I think it's right to say that he was sincere, that he thought he could end the war and that he wanted to end the war. He doesn't want this contest with Russia. He thinks Russia should be on our side against China, rather than thinking Biden was wise to push Russia into China's arms. It's a white Christian country. It's part of Europe. And as he said before, Henry Kissinger agreed with him about that. And so that means he's the smartest guy in the world for thinking that. I don't agree about the against China part, but I do agree about the not being enemies with Russia unnecessarily part, for God's sake. So now it's partly his fault in that he escalated arms shipments to Ukraine during his period there. Then again, his government was completely hijacked by the overall regime while he was president, and especially on Russia policy. I mean, they just absolutely handcuffed him with the Russia Gate and Ukraine Gate hoaxes and all this stuff. So he does deserve some blame for that, but not as much as he might. And then I think he's right that the war wouldn't have started if he'd been in office, if they hadn't have ripped him off in 2020, which I think they did, not by necessarily stealing votes, but by rigging, through government control, rigging all the social media against
culture war.
him, the way that they did. Yeah. And other things too. But because I think he would have negotiated in good faith, where the Biden regime was just not interested in negotiating in good faith at all at that point. In fact, there's a brand new thing out. Angela Merkel today says that when negotiations were breaking down, essentially Biden and Trump had a lousy meeting in July of 21. Did I say Biden and Trump? I meant Biden and Putin.
Yeah.
Had a lousy meeting in July of 21. And Merkel says she wanted to start a brand new round of talks between the EU and Russia, and that Poland and the Baltic states spiked it. And so she never got the chance, and then she lost power, and then it was just idiot Joe Biden driving from there. So, all real
But
chances.
wasn't she
for
the one who
diplomacy.
said that, hey, we're going to get this Minsk thing so we can, arm
Yes.
the Ukrainians, and, we're going to pretend that we're making peace and we're actually preparing for war?
Yes, but she was lying when she said that. So the actual fact is she came to Washington in October, may have been early November, I guess October, I think, of 14. And she told Obama, I'm going to Minsk and I'm making a deal with Putin. I want your blessing, but I'm going. She came to Washington out of deference to the emperor, but she was determined. And he said, okay, go ahead. And America didn't participate at all. And she and Francois Hollande, Putin, and Poroshenko hammered out Minsk 1. And then there was an addendum a few weeks later. And then finally, after Debaltseve in February of 2015, they did Minsk 2, which Obama reluctantly, but at her insistence, essentially rubber stamped, and the UN Security Council rubber stamped as the official deal. That was her insistence, that she did not want for the war to continue on. And in fact, her government continued to try to solve the problem because America would not put pressure on Kiev to implement the deal. And in fact, would try to sabotage any German diplomacy to actually get the damn deal implemented. That was during Obama and during Trump. And in fact, Trump's, in 2019, Merkel's foreign minister was a guy named Steinmeier. And he introduced what was called the Steinmeier formula, which was essentially reordering the sequence of the implementation of the Minsk 2 deal to try to make a new compromise out of it. Because the Ukrainians were ridiculously, essentially, preposterously insisting that you have to do it entirely our way, where essentially the rebels have to entirely surrender to Kiev. Kiev gets to entirely monopolize all of the territory, and only then can we hold new elections, and only then will we negotiate federalism and whatever, which was not the deal. So Steinmeier says, well, look, let's try to come up with a new compromise for the order of operations here so we can get this thing done. And Trump's ambassador, William Taylor, intervened and told the new president, Zelensky, don't do this. Don't go along with it. Steinmeier doesn't know what he's doing, and thwarted the diplomacy there and prevented them from making peace. So Merkel was trying to do that. Now, what you're referring to is true, but it was a lie. So what had happened was, I forget who said it first, but somebody said it first, and then Zelensky, Poroshenko, Francois Hollande, Angela Merkel, and a few others, and I guess a couple of the advisors to Zelensky as well, had said, oh, Minsk 2 was always a ruse. Minsk 2 was just to buy us time to build up Ukraine's military for the inevitable next round of war with Russia. And so we never meant to negotiate with them. We were just biding time. Now, the thing is, I think that was true on the part of Poroshenko. Now, it's probably true on the part of the United States of America. Those sound like the kind of words that might have come right out of Victoria Nuland's mouth. But it's contrary to Angela Merkel's record. So when she came out and said, yeah, that's right, we were just biding time. We were helping to build up Kiev before the war broke out again. And that was all. This is like right in, I don't know, the spring of 22, I guess, at the height of all the political hype against Russia after the invasion. And so everyone was saying that it was all a ruse. And she looked like Neville Chamberlain trying to appease Hitler if she was being sincere with that whole Minsk 2 thing. Right. Now that we can all see that Russia never meant it. So you weren't being a weak, cowardly appeaser, were you, Angela? And then she goes, no, of course not. That wasn't me. We were just biding time to build up their force. When clearly she was not. She was trying to save her policy, which was the Eurasian home, an attempt to build up Germany and somewhat limit the United States by building this new deal with Vladimir Putin's Russia, which America was determined to thwart and destroy, and successfully did.
So what do you think what is your prognosis for the Russia-Ukraine situation? Because it appears to be devolving with no signs of slowing down. Kiev last night, I'm not sure you've seen the footage, but Kiev was blacked out by what appeared to be a good portion of the city was blacked out. I'm not sure if it still is, but it seems as though the war is intensifying. So what are your thoughts on where this is going? What would you expect to unfold there in the next few months?
Yeah. So this goes back to what I was saying before I went on whatever tangent I did about Trump would like to end this war, but he just can't because he just got sworn in at the wrong time, man. What's happening in the war? Here's the status quo in the war. The Russians are winning slowly. And the Ukrainians are losing slowly. And they're both losing a lot of guys, but they both have a lot more guys to lose. And they keep feeding them in there. And the Russians have claimed that they are going to take and quote unquote protect all of the Donbass. That is Donetsk and Luhansk. Now they control all of Luhansk. They only control about 3/4 of Donetsk. And 1/4 of Donetsk is still quite a bit of territory. They've also claimed control and to own permanently in their law, in Russian law. They have fully annexed Zaporozhye and Kherson, which are the 2 major provinces on the way to Crimea from the Donbass there, the Azov coast. So if you're picturing the Crimean Peninsula sticking down there, everything east of there, right? That whole southern coast and a thick band there, Novorossiya is what they used to call it. Now, in recent negotiations, in recent trial balloons, Moscow has said that they might even be willing to climb down on Zaporozhye and Kherson and draw the lines where they are, rather than insisting on taking the rest of them. Whether they're really going to do that or not, I don't know, but they still have a hell of a lot to conquer there. And in the case of Kherson, it's on the other side of the river. So the Russians may very well not want that much of Kherson at this point. Screw it, right? But it's hard to see them backing down on Donetsk. And so on the other side, the Ukrainians are standing on that ground. And they're going to turn around and walk away from the part of Donetsk they still control. They sure don't want to.
So why can't Trump walk away in your mind? What is holding him to this conflict?
Well, America and the West, the allies still have major support going on for Ukraine. So they have major resources at their disposal to keep them in the war.
But why, if Trump wants to end the war, why doesn't he just stop supplying weapons and give Putin what he wants?
Well, look, I don't want to make excuses for the guy because I am for just total non-intervention here. And there are options here to do full-scale diplomacy. And if somebody has a real mandate to get in there and figure out what it would take to get a compromise, no matter what, then I think it could be done. On the other hand, essentially asking Trump to stop funding Ukraine is for example, a lot taller order than, at least morally, never mind the influence of the lobby and everything, but just on the overall optics of the thing. I hate that term. How it looks to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Abandoning Ukraine when they have been invaded and part of their countries being conquered looks a lot different than getting on the phone and telling Netanyahu to stop invading Gaza, to cease fire against the people that he's assaulting in every way, right? So for Trump to just say, and look what happened at the beginning of the year. He said, we're calling off support, we're urging negotiations, but then he couldn't solve it. So now he's like, well, what am I going to do? Completely leave them high and dry? He's got the deniability of hiding behind the Europeans or buying the weapons. So now it's not American tax money going directly to it, but we're still giving them all the weapons. And I don't know, but I assume that American generals are still running the war out of Germany, as they have been this whole time. So to call all that off and to allow a friend to be totally destroyed is bad politics, man.
But for Trump, has he ever cared about that? Like, I mean, this is a guy who will do drastic things and seemingly without any concern about the consequences. So why is he suddenly so concerned about what people are going to think if he abandons Ukraine? That's why, like, I am of the view that clearly he is aware of the fact that there is a existential reason as far as the American military-industrial complex, the Euro complex, the transatlantic, U.S. as a global reserve currency, all this stuff. I think he's aware that if he pulls out of Ukraine, despite all the political niceties and the tokenism with Putin and Alaska and all this stuff, he knows that the U.S. and Russia are diametrically opposed and are enemies. But he can't bring himself to, and I'm not saying that should be the case, I'm just saying that he knows that, but he's pretending as though there is some path to rapprochement when it doesn't seem like he's doing anything to bring us there. In fact, things have only escalated. Like, I always use the example of if Biden would have said, hey, I'm sending 2 nuclear submarines to Russia's coastline, I mean, people would have freaked out. If he would have said, I'm sending Tomahawk missiles, which are nuclear capable, which were, up until recently, covered under the INF Treaty, people would have been freaking out, losing their minds. But you go on, in the mega forums, and it's like crickets. Nobody cares. So something is off here, I just can't.
That always happens with partisanship,
So what is the, do you think this is going to keep getting worse? Like, are we going to keep pushing things? Is brinkmanship going to ramp up to the nuclear level?
Well, look, I mean, I'm not predicting war between NATO and the Russian Federation, but I think the war in Ukraine is going to go on. I think Trump might even find a way to lift some sanctions and try to normalize relations with Russia even while this goes on. And just say, look, pal, I can't do anything about this. It's on autopilot, it's going, but let's figure out what we can get along with anyway. And quite frankly, that is how Putin does business and has always been. It'd be like, yes, America is financing terrorist suicide bombers against us in Chechnya. It really offends our senses when our great American partners who we cooperate with on so many wonderful things sometimes make mistakes in judgment like that, or you know what I mean? Like he doesn't care.
Well, just today,
he doesn't care. It's all business with him. So
he
Trump
was
can
flattering
find a way
Trump today and saying that what is her name, Maria Machado, who won the Nobel Peace Prize today. Putin was saying, "Oh, it should have been Trump that won that." Obviously, trying to pump up his ego and flatter him.
Sure. Yeah.
And of course, I don't know if that's going to work because I think that's all.
I hope it does.
I think both
works
of those
for everyone
guys,
else.
Yeah, I don't know.
Look, I got to say, and this goes to your thing about he does these crazy things. He doesn't care what anyone thinks. I think he does these crazy things only because he cares only about what people think. It's just the question is which people at which times is he trying to impress, or who's flattering him or who's sucking up to him at any given time, or who it is that he thinks is his audience on any particular thing that he does. I think that's probably basically the only rhyme or reason to his behavior is what he thinks other people think. And it's really hard to to nail him down on any other, major thing going on. Now, there's going to be a conflict. Like, he knows, well, the Israel lobby wants this, and the majority of the people want that. And so then he has to choose who he's pleasing sometimes. But it's always about pleasing somebody. And mostly so you can get them to say, wow, you're so tall and successful and handsome and great, and you're the best president since Abraham Lincoln. Because that's all he really wants out of life, is for people to tell him exactly things like that. Your hairstyle, like, it's totally believable, man. Or something.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we're putting too much stock in Trump as the decision maker, and he is really just put there, I think, with most presidents, to be a focal point for people's disdain. And
he's a bit of a unique creature compared to Jeb Bush or Hillary Clinton in that way. Yeah. He does have his special interests. Right. But I think probably unique in my lifetime. Here's a guy who was sitting around shooting the shit with Roger Stone. And Roger Stone said, that Jeb Bush, he's weak, Donald. You could take him, man. Let's do this. And Trump went, man, you know what? I think I can. And that was just it. He was not recruited by Citibank like Barack Obama was. He was not recruited by, Skull and Bones like H.W. Bush or whatever, right? It was just him and Roger Stone going, you know what? You kneel down behind him, I'll push him over. And they're just able to do it. And you look at 2016, and see, here's the thing too, people really underestimate about Donald Trump. Like, everybody knows this, but I think they don't think about it in context. He's the most famous man who ever lived. He's way more famous than Michael Jackson. He's Michael Jackson in 1985 forever. And he's been that famous since those days. Since the days of Michael Jackson and Madonna and Hawk versus Sassoy and all of that stuff. And then he had a whole new kind of revamping and rebranding and everything through the 1990s with all his buildings and stuff. And then I remember reading this in 2015. I had no idea. I don't watch TV. I read Donald Trump has hosted The Apprentice for 14 seasons on NBC? And I'm like, oh, that's it, dude. 14 seasons? And this guy, he is the Golden Arches, man. He's a can of Coca-Cola Classic. He is Americana, like a license plate on the wall at your diner, right? Like, he is, what are you going to do about Donald G.D. Trump, dude? He's larger than life. There's no billionaire that's as famous as him. There's no TV personality or movie star that has his kind of money or his kind of pull. And you look at how he did it.
World War III president.
Yeah, maybe, because he is a rogue, right? He was not groomed for this spot. He was not a governor. He was not a vice president or a senator. He did not please all the right people to get in there. He went in there with a stiff arm and kicked everybody's ass is how he got in there, right? And so, unfortunately, right, to me, it's like, like the Book of Job or whatever. It's just like God and the devil playing a practical joke on us all. We're like, Ron Paul was the hero we needed. But let's be honest, Donald Trump is the hero we deserved, right? Like, this is, this is what we get. We wanted an end to Bush, Clinton, McCain, Bidenism.
But we got Trump coin. This
was our only alternative.
We got Trump coin, though. We didn't get rid of the Federal Reserve.
Invest in that today, everybody. Cash in your life savings now.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts about the deployments of the National Guard and the whole ICE thing, and now even talk about the Insurrection Act? What are your thoughts on all those things?
Oh, man, I hadn't heard him say the Insurrection Act. No, I don't like it at all, man. I'm against any of this militarization and federalization of police as much as possible. I think, look, all other things being equal, because I'm a libertarian. I'm essentially against government doing anything ever. On the other hand, I'm living in this world, and I do think that I guess I have finally taken the libertarian view that, keeping people out might be a government program, but letting mass migration happen is also a government program. That, if we're just people in any other context, we would prevent that. Can't just let tens of millions of illegal immigrants into the country at a time. It's just too many to be assimilated to even know what American culture is even supposed to be, that they're supposed to want to adopt at least a little bit of. at all. Like, it's just, tens of thousands of Chinese nationals, fighting age males. Like, I don't know who these dudes are. And I don't want to get like too paranoid and too right wing about that stuff. Like, oh, Hezbollah has taken over Latin America or whatever. No,
Right.
no. On the other hand, I think it is certainly appropriate, especially, and it is the national government's responsibility to round up criminal illegal aliens and get rid of them. And then for the rest of them, it ought to be somebody's job, probably on the state level, to find them and deport these people. On the other hand, then, you have these protesters who come out. And this is, like in the 1990s, when I was a New World Order kook, I would have told you this is all a conspiracy, dude, and that the leftists are being made to go out there and provide this protesting chaos against
Problem, reaction,
these moves
solution.
in order to justify an even further clampdown and further precedent set as far as the military on the streets. Now, I'm not certain I believe that necessarily. It could just be, really opposing forces. And there sure are a hell of a lot of leftists in the country and a lot of migrants and their supporters or whatever who are protesting certainly of their own free will and with their own agenda. I don't want to deprive them of their agency. Then again, George Soros and the NGOs sure do like backing a lot of groups just like this all around the world in order to get what they want. And, the Justice Department has been promising indictments along those lines soon. And I'd like to hear them because, quite frankly, I think, the similarity between Antifa and some of these other groups and Otpor and the other color-coded revolution, regime changers overseas are like pretty significant. I want to know the full extent of the network from USAID and NED and the Soros NGOs to the groups that are backing the protesters in the streets and where, how that's all organized and what. But it's just like with war. You could bring me your wheelbarrow full of problems. There's got to be a better way than invoking the Insurrection Act or, trying to figure out an excuse to get around posse comitatus and put the regular army on the streets. We have plenty of National Guard in this country. And if we have National Guard overseas somewhere, then bring them home from somewhere and let them do their job, which would be just backing up local police here, right? Rather than enforcing the law themselves. As far as bringing out regular infantry or anything like that, this is an absolute outrage. Nobody should stand for this. And the thing is, the Posse Comitatus Act and the Insurrection Act and all that, I haven't read them in a while, but they're pretty specific about what the nature of the threat has to be before you're allowed to go this far. This is the United States of America, man, not some sock puppet fascist dictatorship that the United States of America supports overseas somewhere. Can't just do this stuff. What the hell? And I don't know, you might be too young for this, but when I was a boy, people would say, hey, this is America. And that meant you can't do that because I got my rights. And that's hardly even a cliche anymore. But that used to be built into the thing that unlike those other places, you can't do that to us here.
I get the vibe from a lot of MAGA supporters that they think the left will never be in power again. It's like, what do you think they're going to do with these this new precedent that you've set to put military in the streets? And this is how, like you're saying, both sides, and there used to be the libertarian view, and even, one of the most popular people in that political persuasion, Alex Jones, used to rail about martial law and posse comitatus and all this stuff. And it seems like people have forgotten that, well, eventually the left is going to get into power and they're going to exploit these new tools that you've given them against you. And this is why you have to be very careful in terms of how much power you afford government at any given time. And I agree with you that there's a need for militarism and the corporal approach to certain things. But we also have to look at it. What are they doing to address the underlying issues? If there's underlying socioeconomic, cultural issues that are percolating all of these problems, whether it's crime or whatever, then what are they actually, is it a multi-pronged approach, or is it just, military coercion in the hopes that they're going to be able to squeeze that and wrangle that criminal element out of society without actually addressing the underlying root causes, which of course will provide it, it will just emerge once again somewhere
And look,
else.
it's got to be the case. And I guess this goes to the question of assimilation and all that. Doesn't everybody agree that our great tradition is that if the troops are on the streets, National Guard, for example, that would only be because of a temporary emergency, like a wildfire or a flood, or, for example, the LA riots, where you have, people are, totally out of control, and the local and state police, civilian police, are not equipped to deal. And you do need squads of men with rifles in order to force everyone to knock it off and go home. We're still talking about American civilians, though. So the point of calling out the National Guard in the LA riots was to say this riot is over, not we're actually going to have the National Guard shooting people, because they weren't. They were just there essentially to stand around to back up the local cops whose job it was to take control again, kind of thing, which was over and done in a weekend or whatever once they began it, right? Once they called out the troops, that was the end of that. There's a real question here, like, wherever crime is bad, Trump is going to call out the National Guard and maybe even the Army, and leave them there for how long? I saw people saying, man, Washington, D.C. is actually really nice now because the street crime has really come to an end because there are soldiers standing around. But then is that how we're going to just do it from now on? Like it's going to be a 1980s dystopian movie where at one point they just decided to go ahead and put soldiers all over the streets all the time. That absolutely should not be the case. And even on the ICE roundups, on the mass roundups, on the immigration raids, that can all be civilian police, even if you need legions of national police. And I'm just saying, all other things being equal, for the sake of this argument, if you need mass roundups of illegal immigrants, you still hire massive numbers of civilian police to do that. You don't necessarily need the National Guard to do that. And I don't like them taking advantage of anything to call out, military force for civilian law enforcement roles. It's crazy. And as you're saying, dude, just because you like the guy in power now, Chelsea Clinton could be our next president. Let's get real, dude. You know what I mean? You could be in real danger here.
Well, and then you're going to have military in the streets, and when the next biological, pathogen emerges, the lockdown is going to be militant. And so this is like the left introduced us to the lockdowns. Well, I guess Trump did. He started it. But, the left really took it to a new level. And then the right has put troops on the streets, and you marry those two things, and that's not the situation I want to find myself in.
I mean, luckily, there's just not enough troops for all that anyway. That's why they're only good for a temporary, reinforcement measure in some riot or in a forest fire or some kind of thing. Imagine the National Guard trying to essentially, or the military in any sense, trying to supplant civilian rule in the state of Texas. No way. Not in 1,000 years. No matter how many Jade Helm hoaxes you've had to suffer through, that is never going to happen.
Yeah, unless it's, automation makes it so that that's the only job you can get is to be in military fatigues.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Yeah.
It's
you can
possible.
just get a job coding AI to tell the troops where to go and who to shoot.
Yeah. So just in conclusion then, so you think that the Russia situation is going to fizzle out? You don't foresee a war with Europe?
Right. Yeah, I don't. They've shown
more
for 3 years
optimistic
now.
than me.
Nobody's that irrational on the thing. What's going to happen is the Russians are going to win, the Ukrainians are going to lose and sue for peace at some point. The only question to me is whether Russia's going to try to take Odessa or whether they're going to be happy with everything east of the river. And for that matter, I mean, they might not even go that far. They have not staked a claim on Dnipropetrovsk or on Sumy or Kharkiv. They had troops in Kharkiv. They still have troops fighting in Kharkiv, but they're not, I don't think, attempting to annex that province and that major city there. They claim they only want Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Crimea. And that's doable. And I think they could potentially, this is kind of a very slow grind, but there are recent reports about real holes. I guess it was a Ukrainian military report, meaning they got major holes in their lines and that, they're beginning to really crumble there. So I don't know how quickly it's going to go. It could be, a steep drop as Ukrainian lines break and flee, or maybe not. maybe the Russians will be able to exploit those gaps. Maybe they won't. I don't know exactly what's going to happen there. But as I say, the Russians are winning slowly, and there doesn't seem to be any changing that. So, and then at some point, look, they'll get what they insist on, which is a guarantee of no NATO membership for Ukraine and a guarantee of essentially permanent neutrality for Ukraine and a guarantee of protection for the rights of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians inside what's left of Ukraine after that. And a guarantee that America will not, militarize or station troops or missiles inside Ukraine. And then that'll be it. And then we'll have lost, America and our Ukrainian friends will have fought and lost this whole war for nothing. And they could have just negotiated in the first place. Even in the negotiations of April 22, the Russians were willing to talk about some kind of special status for the Donbass. In other words, even leaving them still inside Ukraine with like full statehood kind of, but still as part of Ukraine rather than absorbed into Russia. That was after the war already began. And they didn't claim Zaporozhye and Kherson until September of 22, after Ukraine had their big successful push in Kharkiv and Kherson. And so they said, okay, well, now we're going to officially annex Zaporozhye and Kherson and claimed even more territory. It's been all downhill from there. So, yes, look, if I worked for Marco Rubio, I don't know what I'd tell him. You know what I mean? We're not in any real position of strength to make Russia stop.
I always say it's a battle between cowardice and greed. And in the race, in the arms race, the nuclear arms race, we can only hope that cowardice will prevail and that people's greed will not be able to establish itself. So, well, on that note, we're going to end on that's a positive note to end up with on this channel, because usually, most of my guests have a much more pessimistic outlook. I personally do. I don't think it's going to be resolved. I think it's going to get much worse. But hey, it's good to hear, that somebody else has a rosier picture of the future. Where can people learn more about?
You're talking about me? Okay.
Compared to the people that we bring on the channel, I assure you, you are, okay. You're much more optimistic.
Scott Horton, perennial optimist. There you go.
Yeah. Where can people learn more about you, Scott?
ScottHortonShow.com, ScottHorton.org, antiwar.com, libertarianinstitute.org, and Amazon.com. Buy my books. Fool's Errand about Afghanistan, enough already about the rest of the terror wars and Afghanistan, and Provoked, which is the background to, and including the war as well, the story of the lead up to the war in Ukraine.
I heard Napolitano, he said it was the definitive compendium of prehistory of the Ukraine-Russia war. So if people want to get a crash course in what precipitated the conflict with NATO and Russia, go and read that book. And I'm going to simplify it for people. I'm going to post the link to your YouTube channel in the description. YouTube loves that. So you guys can find all of his information right there. Thanks for coming out, Scott. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.